Hello, you're watching Altek2k Gaming.
Freeze in Expedition is a real nightmare.
In this video I'll show you how to avoid freeze, and hopefully stay alive a lot longer. So why is freeze such a problem in Expedition League compared to previous leagues? The main reason is the flask changes that were made this league. Previously, the off-heat flask would cause us to get immunity to both chill and freeze during any flask effect, as a flask effect lasted about 5 seconds, and we could also spam it because we could constantly get charges back. The number of charges we get now is much lower. And if you didn't know, you get charges each time you kill mobs. The new off-heat flask does something a little bit different. They've split out the chill and freeze immunity to 2 separate lines. Grants immunity to chill for 4 seconds if used while chilled, and then grants immunity to freeze for 4 seconds if used while frozen. Now, when you're frozen, you're also classed as chilled, so this will wipe both off. However, if you're chilled, so if you get chilled and therefore your action speed is reduced, you could then attack and move slower. If you use your flask at this point, it will wipe off the chill, but then it won't give you immunity to freeze because you weren't frozen. So you really now need to leave this flask until you are frozen. And my current flask, I only get 2 uses before I run out of charges. So if using quick succession, I could be pretty frozen pretty fast, and then I'll die. Or I would if I didn't use other mitigation steps. Now also, most ascendancies used to give you some kind of immunity to elemental ailments. Now only the Pathfinder still does, and only during flask effect. So with that said, how do we mitigate freeze now? One is the off-heat flask itself, and we can also help that by triggering it. So if we use an instilling orb on a flask, there's a chance to get used when you become frozen, which I've got on my flask here, and what that will do is, whenever you take a freezing blow, it will trigger the flask, wipe off the freeze and the chill. That means that I can put the flask at the end of my flask row and not actually use it and only reserve it for the use of freeze, which is actually what I do. So for the other forms of freeze mitigation, it's good to understand why freeze is applied in the first place. So any cold damage hit has a chance to give freeze. And the chance to freeze can be based on a number of things. The monster, what we've got in our passive tree if we're applying the freeze, but also whether it's a critical strike or not. A critical strike will always freeze if it reaches the 0.3 second criteria. So what is the 0.3 second criteria? For each 1% of our life that is taken with a cold hit that causes freeze, we will gain 60 milliseconds of freeze duration. Those 60 milliseconds must add up to 0.3 of a second in order to trigger at all, otherwise it's discarded. Now that means that they only need to do 5% of our life pool in damage with a cold hit in order to freeze us. 0.3 seconds probably isn't going to get us killed, we'll be defrosted before that. If they do up to 50%, it will last for a whopping 3 seconds. And if we're fighting Veritania, where certain of our attacks cause double freeze duration, we could be blocked for up to 6 seconds. This is incredibly nasty, and will probably get us killed. So what other ways do we have of mitigating the freeze? During the acts, there's a chance to drop a pair of boots called Wanderlusts. These can be used from level 1 all the way to endgame and grant immunity to freeze. Now these aren't guaranteed to drop, so the chances are you aren't going to get a pair. So failing that, in Act 2 you can go and visit one of the traders, and most characters are able to buy Arctic armour. This was changed earlier this league to grant freeze immunity. Note that it doesn't affect chill, and so this skill won't remove chill. So this is well worth levelling with to prevent yourself from freezing and dying. Once we get to the end game where we might not have the mana to reserve the aura for this skill and don't want to use Wanderlust, what else can we do? So there is a craft that you can put on your boots, but this is incredibly expensive, coming in at an X, and this will give you immunity to freeze. So that's out of most people's price range, so what else can we do? We can either get more life to make it harder for them to do more damage and therefore make a longer freeze duration. We can also stop the hit from freezing us, and there are several ways of doing that. We can dodge or evade the hit, or we can block it. Blocking prevents all elemental ailments from actually hitting us. So if we reach block cap, 3 out of 4 hits will be blocked, and therefore 3 out of 4 hits cannot possibly freeze us. We can also avoid running critical strike maps, because if we get ice people in those, they're going to freeze us. There's also a stat in the game, chance to avoid being chilled or chance to avoid being frozen during flask effect, and also chance to avoid elemental ailments in general. The easiest way of getting chance to avoid being frozen is from the Taste of Hate flask, which grants us a 30% chance to avoid being both chilled and frozen. So almost 1 in 3 hits then will avoid freezing us. We can also get the elemental stat off Abyssal Jewels and the tree. Now you'll need to get it to 100% to completely avoid taking that damage. You can also craft certain avoidance on gear using certain essences, I believe, as well. If you want to see some of my other guides, you can find them here and here. If you've liked this video, then please tickle that like button. It will like it immensely. It will. Go on, tickle it. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.